The sun rose over the open prairie with a pale, tired light, spilling across miles of dry grass and brittle fences. Every morning began this way for Daniel, a rancher whose life had become a cycle of endless work and quiet worry. He pushed open the creaking door of his weathered farmhouse and stepped into the sharp morning air. The ground was hard from weeks without rain, and a thin layer of dust clung to his boots with every step. He paused to listen to the restless lowing of cattle in the distance. They sounded hungry. They always sounded hungry these days. The ranch had once belonged to his grandfather, a man who built it with his own hands when the soil was still rich and the streams ran full. Now the streams were little more than memory. Daniel carried that legacy on his shoulders like a heavy saddle, determined not to let the land die under his care, even as the odds turned against him. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and sweat filled the air. Daniel ran his calloused hands along the backs of his horses, checking their ribs, noticing again how thin they had become. Feed cost more each month, and his savings shrank with every trip to the supply store. He tightened the girth of the saddle on his oldest mare, a gentle creature who had carried him through countless long days. The leather creaked under his weight as he mounted, and for a moment he simply sat in silence, scanning the horizon. The land stretched in every direction, a vast expanse of muted gold and gray. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, but to Daniel it also carried a quiet threat. Beauty did not pay debts. Beauty did not keep cattle alive through winter. He rode out to the north pasture, where a sagging fence line waited for repairs. His gloved hands worked with steady efficiency, but each strike of the hammer echoed like a question in his mind. How much longer could he keep this up? The bank wanted payments he could barely manage. The price of beef had dropped again. Neighbors spoke of selling out or moving east, but Daniel could not imagine leaving the only home he had ever known. This ranch was his history, his duty, and his burden. Pride kept him tied to it, even as sleepless nights grew longer and his body ached from years of strain. As the sun climbed higher, heat shimmered across the fields. Sweat dampened his shirt and trickled down his back. He stopped to wipe his brow and drank from a dented canteen, tasting the metallic tang of warm water. Overhead, a hawk circled lazily, searching for a meal in the dry grass below. Daniel envied the bird's freedom even as he admired its persistence. Survival was a language they both understood. He climbed back into the saddle and nudged the mare toward the Southern Creek bed, though he already knew what he would find there. The creek was a narrow ribbon of mud, the water low enough to reveal cracked stones and tangled weeds. His cattle milled nearby, eyes dull with thirst. He spoke softly to them, his voice a mix of comfort and apology, promising what he could not guarantee. By midday he returned to the house, shoulders heavy and hands stiff from labor. Inside, the rooms felt too quiet, too empty. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight that slipped through thin curtains. The table still held the faint scent of the morning's coffee, now cold in the pot. He hung his hat on the worn hook by the door and stared for a long moment at the faded photographs on the wall. His parents smiled from behind the glass, captured in a time when the ranch was strong and the future seemed secure. Daniel felt the familiar tug of loneliness, sharp and deep. Work filled his days, but it left his nights hollow. He longed for conversation, for laughter, for the sound of another heartbeat in the house. Yet he pushed the feeling aside, the way he always did. Survival left little room for longing. That evening, after feeding the animals and securing the barn, Daniel sat on the porch as dusk settled over the prairie. The sky blushed with streaks of orange and violet, a quiet reminder that beauty still existed even in hard times. He leaned back in the old rocking chair and listened to the chorus of crickets rising from the grass. A soft wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and distant rain that would likely never arrive. In the fading light, he thought about the coming winter and the choices that waited just beyond tomorrow. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of his ranch, strangers faced their own battles. He wondered if any of them were as tired as he was, or if they too clung to dreams that felt smaller each passing year. The night deepened around him, the stars blinking awake one by one, and Daniel remained still, a lone figure holding fast to a life that refused to break even as it bent under the weight of hardship. The next morning came with a brittle chill that slipped through the thin walls of the farmhouse and settled in Daniel's bones. He rose before dawn, as he always did, the habit of a man who measured his days in chores and obligations. The stove glowed faintly from last night's embers, offering just enough warmth to make coffee and light a lantern. The smell of strong black brew filled the room, carrying a comfort that did little to ease the knot in his stomach. He sipped slowly while staring out the small window over the sink, watching the horizon bleed from black to pale gray. A storm had moved through during the night, leaving frost along the fence rails and a sharp edge to the air. He pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, the fabric stiff from years of wear, and stepped outside to meet the morning. The world beyond the door was quiet except for the crunch of frozen earth beneath his boots. Cattle shifted in the pens, their breath rising in white plumes against the dawn. Daniel tightened his scarf and moved among them, checking for signs of illness, counting heads, noting which animals needed extra feed. Each step carried the weight of calculation. How many bales remained? How many dollars were left in the bank? How long he could stretch both before another hard decision loomed? He spoke to the animals in low murmurs, the way his father had once done, as though the sound of a steady human voice might keep fear at bay. The cows flicked their ears at the sound, but gave no other sign they understood. Still, he kept talking. It filled the emptiness of the cold morning and reminded him that he was not completely alone. When the work in the pens was done, he saddled his mare and rode toward the neighboring settlement. A notice posted at the feed store a week earlier had caught his attention. It mentioned a labor auction taking place on the edge of town, a gathering where men and women desperate for work offered their hands to ranchers and farmers. Daniel had never attended one. The very idea unsettled him, but desperation had a way of softening convictions. His fences needed mending, his herd needed tending, and winter promised more hardship than he could shoulder alone. He told himself it was simply business, that he would pay a fair wage and treat whoever he hired with respect. Yet a part of him feared what he might see there, the quiet suffering of people who had run out of choices. The settlement appeared after an hour's ride, a scattering of wooden buildings framed by bare cottonwoods and a wind-scoured road. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, carrying the scent of burning pine. Daniel dismounted near the general store and tied his horse to a hitching post. He adjusted his coat and stepped into the cold bustle of the street. Men with rough faces and worn hats moved with purpose, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust and frost. Women stood in small groups near the auction yard, their shawls pulled tight against the wind, eyes scanning the crowd for potential employers. Children clung to their mothers' skirts or huddled together in silence, their cheeks flushed with cold. A makeshift platform had been erected in the center of the yard, little more than a raised wooden crate. A man with a loud voice and a heavy coat called out names, each one followed by a brief description of skills: cook, seamstress, ranch hand, field worker. Bidders raised gloved hands, deals were struck, and the chosen individuals were led away to new futures that smelled of sweat and survival. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, uneasy. The scene felt too much like a marketplace for people, though the transactions were voluntary. He reminded himself that these men and women were here because they wanted work, because they needed a way to feed their families or escape the cold. Still, the sight of worn faces and desperate eyes gnawed at him. He almost turned to leave when a quiet movement near the back of the platform caught his attention. A woman stepped forward, her posture straight despite the biting wind. She wore a plain brown coat, the hem frayed but clean, and a simple woolen scarf wrapped around her neck. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, was braided loosely over one shoulder, a few strands escaping to dance in the breeze. Her face carried the soft lines of maturity, neither young nor old, with eyes the color of storm clouds, deep, watchful, and impossibly calm. The caller introduced her simply as Margaret, 39 years old, skilled in housekeeping and field labor. No family, no mention of where she had come from or why she now stood alone in the cold. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was the steadiness of her gaze, or the quiet dignity with which she faced the crowd. Unlike many others, she did not fidget or plead. She did not lower her eyes or force a smile. She simply waited, a figure of quiet strength framed by the gray sky. The caller repeated her details and asked for bids. For a long moment, no one spoke. A few men glanced her way and then looked elsewhere, murmuring to each other about her age, about younger workers who might offer more years of service. Daniel heard the comments and felt a flicker of anger on her behalf. Age, he thought, was no measure of worth. If anything, it spoke of resilience. His hand rose almost before he realized what he was doing. The caller's eyes lit up, relief flashing across his face as he named a modest sum. No one countered. The gavel came down with a dull thud, and the deal was done. Daniel stepped forward, heart pounding, as Margaret descended the platform with measured grace. Up close, he saw the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and the steady set of her mouth. She carried no luggage beyond a small canvas bag slung across her shoulder. When their eyes met, she offered a slight nod, neither grateful nor resentful, simply acknowledging the moment that had joined their fates. "I'm Daniel," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "I've got a ranch a few miles out. It's honest work, hard but honest." Margaret studied him for a heartbeat, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Hard work is all I know," she replied quietly. Her voice was warm but measured, each word deliberate, as though she weighed them before speaking. Daniel felt an unexpected sense of respect for her restraint. This was not a woman who wasted words or bowed easily to circumstance. They walked together to his horse, the crowd thinning as other deals concluded. Daniel offered to carry her bag, but she shook her head and kept it slung over her shoulder. He admired the quiet independence in that simple gesture. As they left the settlement, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint sound of hammering from distant rooftops. The mare snorted and tossed her head as Daniel helped Margaret mount behind him. He felt the careful distance she maintained, polite but firm, as they settled into the long ride back to the ranch. The prairie stretched wide and endless around them, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the frozen grass. Daniel pointed out landmarks: the dry creek bed, the old cottonwood that marked the halfway point, the distant ridge where coyotes often gathered at dusk. Margaret listened without interruption, her eyes scanning the horizon with quiet curiosity. Once, when a gust of wind tugged at her scarf, he caught a glimpse of the determined set of her jaw and the faint flush on her cheeks. There was strength there, the kind born not from muscle, but from years of enduring whatever life demanded. As the miles passed, Daniel found himself speaking more than he expected. He told her about the ranch, about the stubborn cattle and the failing fences, about the long winters that tested even the hardiest souls. He spoke of his parents and grandparents, of the legacy he struggled to protect. Margaret listened with a focus that felt rare, her silence neither empty nor indifferent but alive with understanding. When she finally spoke, her words were simple yet carried a weight that settled deep in his chest. "A place like that," she said softly, "is worth fighting for." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet as they approached the ranch. Daniel felt a strange sense of anticipation, a quiet recognition that something important had begun. He did not know what lay ahead, whether Margaret would stay through the winter, whether she would find a new path once the snows melted. But he sensed that her arrival would change more than just the workload. There was a steadiness about her, a quiet strength that seemed to fit the land as naturally as the wind or the stars. As the house came into view, its weathered boards glowing in the fading light, Daniel tightened his grip on the reins and guided the mare toward home, unaware that this simple ride marked the first step in a story that neither of them could yet imagine. The first days after Margaret's arrival unfolded with a quiet rhythm that settled into the ranch like a slow-moving dawn. Daniel woke before the sun, as he always did, but now he found someone else awake when he entered the kitchen. Margaret moved with calm efficiency, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair braided neatly over one shoulder. The smell of fresh coffee and cornmeal greeted him instead of the bitter emptiness he had grown used to. She did not ask where anything belonged. She simply found what was needed, as though the years of hard labor had trained her hands to bring order to any space she entered. Daniel offered to show her how the stove worked, but she gave a small, amused glance and said softly, "I think I can manage." He stood for a moment watching her measure flour and stoke the fire, struck by the quiet confidence in her movements. Outside, the ranch waited with its usual demands. Fences sagged under the weight of wind-blown snow, and the cattle milled near the half-frozen creek. Daniel expected Margaret to remain indoors, but after breakfast she stepped into the yard wearing a heavy coat and gloves. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the cold. He tried to explain the harshness of the work, but she only tightened the scarf around her neck and followed him toward the barn. Together they shoveled snow from the pens, mended broken boards, and scattered feed for the restless animals. Daniel noticed the way she lifted heavy bales without complaint, her movements deliberate and sure. Years of toil had left their mark in the strength of her arms and the set of her shoulders. He wanted to tell her to rest, but something in her eyes, an iron steadiness, stopped him. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself studying her in quiet moments. She worked with a focus that belonged to someone long accustomed to survival. There was no wasted motion, no sigh of fatigue, only a quiet endurance that seemed as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. When she paused to catch her breath, he saw a faint flush on her cheeks and the small smile that tugged at the corners of her mouth. It was not joy exactly, but a recognition of purpose. Here was a woman who understood the dignity of labor, who had built her life from hard ground and refused to let it break her. In the evenings they shared simple meals by the stove. Margaret spoke little of her past, but fragments emerged in small, careful pieces. She had been bound to a wealthy household since childhood, her labor secured by a contract signed when she was too young to protest. What began as a promise of apprenticeship became decades of servitude, long hours, little pay, and no freedom to choose her own path. She described the work without bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that revealed the depth of her endurance. "Work is work," she said once, her eyes fixed on the fire. "It keeps the body alive, but it cannot own the soul unless you let it." Daniel listened in silence, anger rising in his chest at the injustice she recounted so plainly. He wanted to ask more, but the calm strength in her voice warned him to tread carefully. Days stretched into a new routine. Margaret took over the kitchen and the small vegetable cellar, turning meager supplies into hearty meals that filled the house with warmth. She organized tools, patched worn clothes, and even repaired the leaking roof of the chicken coop. Daniel, who had carried the ranch alone for so long, felt an unfamiliar lightness in his work. Tasks that once seemed endless now moved faster with her steady presence. He began to look forward to the sound of her footsteps on the porch, the quiet clink of dishes in the kitchen, the soft hum of a tune she sometimes sang while she worked. Yet it was not only the chores that changed. The air inside the house grew different, warmer in ways that had nothing to do with the stove. Daniel caught himself lingering at the table after supper, listening to the gentle rhythm of her voice when she did choose to speak. He noticed the way her eyes softened when she laughed, a sound rare but worth waiting for. He found excuses to ask her opinion on small matters, where to store the winter feed, how to arrange the tack in the barn, just to hear the thoughtful pause before her measured reply. She answered each question with quiet certainty, never seeking control, only offering the wisdom of experience. One evening, a storm rolled across the prairie, dark clouds swallowing the last light of day. Daniel and Margaret worked side by side to secure the livestock before the winds rose. Snow fell in heavy sheets, stinging their faces and coating the ground in minutes. The mare grew restless as thunder rumbled across the open land. Daniel reached for the reins, but Margaret moved first, her voice calm and low as she soothed the animal with gentle strokes. The horse settled under her steady hand, its breath steaming in the cold. Daniel watched, struck by the quiet authority in her touch. In that moment he saw not just a worker but a woman shaped by years of survival, a presence as steady as the land itself. When they finally returned to the cabin, drenched and shivering, Margaret knelt by the stove to build a stronger fire. Daniel brought in more wood, their hands brushing briefly as they worked. The simple contact sent a surprising warmth through him, a spark that lingered long after they sat across from each other drying their clothes. They shared a silent meal, the storm howling outside like a restless beast. In the flicker of lamplight, Daniel caught her watching the window, her eyes reflecting both caution and wonder. He realized she was not merely enduring this new life, she was beginning to claim it. As winter deepened, their partnership grew into something neither had planned. Margaret proved skilled with the livestock, anticipating problems before they arose. She adjusted feeding schedules, spotted signs of illness early, and coaxed reluctant calves to nurse. Daniel, long accustomed to solitude, found himself relying on her judgment without hesitation. He no longer thought of her as a hired hand. She had become a part of the ranch's heartbeat, woven into the rhythm of each day like the steady creak of the windmill or the distant call of coyotes at night. Despite the growing familiarity, Margaret maintained a quiet independence. She accepted Daniel's help when needed but never sought it. She carried her own weight, repaired her own clothes, and handled the roughest tasks with a calm that left him both impressed and humbled. At times, Daniel wondered how many years she had endured without kindness, how many nights she had faced the world alone. He wanted to ask, but something in her steady gaze reminded him that her past belonged to her, and her silence was not an invitation for pity. One particularly cold morning, as frost etched delicate patterns across the windows, Daniel found Margaret standing outside before dawn, her breath rising in silver clouds. She looked out over the prairie, the first light of day turning the snow to pale gold. He joined her without a word. For a long moment they stood side by side, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant groan of ice shifting along the creek. Finally she spoke, her voice low and steady. "This land," she said, "has a way of testing a person. It strips away what isn't real. All that's left is who you truly are." Daniel nodded, the truth of her words settling deep in his chest. In those quiet mornings and long evenings, Daniel began to see the subtle changes her presence brought to the ranch. The animals seemed calmer, the work more manageable, the air inside the cabin warmer even when the wind cut like a knife. He noticed it in himself too, a new steadiness, a sense that the fight to keep the ranch alive was no longer a battle he faced alone. Margaret's strength was not loud or showy. It was a quiet force that steadied everything around her. It was the kind of strength that did not demand recognition, but changed the world all the same. Though neither spoke of the future, a silent understanding grew between them. The long winter nights no longer felt endless. The house, once echoing with emptiness, now carried the gentle sounds of shared life. The soft clatter of dishes, the rustle of blankets, the low murmur of voices exchanging simple observations about the day. Daniel found himself waiting for those sounds, listening for them even in sleep. They were small signs, but they marked the beginning of something larger, a slow thawing of hearts hardened by years of struggle. And as the days lengthened and the first hints of spring teased the horizon, Daniel sensed that the decision he had made in that crowded auction yard was more than a practical choice. It was the opening of a door neither of them had known they were waiting for. Winter clung stubbornly to the prairie, but inside the ranch, a different season was quietly taking root. Days began before sunrise and ended long after dark, yet the work no longer felt like an endless punishment. Margaret's presence had changed the rhythm of everything, though neither she nor Daniel ever named it aloud. The morning still started with the hiss of the kettle and the smell of strong coffee, but now the cabin carried a warmth that came from more than the stove. Margaret moved through each room with a calm certainty, her steady footsteps and soft humming weaving life back into spaces that had long felt hollow. Daniel found himself waking earlier just to hear those small sounds, a music that set the tone for the day before a single word was spoken. Outside, the ranch faced the same relentless demands, but the work felt lighter with four capable hands instead of two. Together, they repaired fences bowed by the weight of ice, hauled feed across fields crusted with frost, and checked the cattle for signs of illness. Margaret worked without complaint, her breath visible in the cold air as she carried heavy bales or swung a hammer with precise, practiced strikes. Daniel often caught himself watching her from a distance, noting the way her eyes narrowed with focus or how her braids slipped loose as she bent to her tasks. She possessed a quiet strength that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a steadiness that matched the land in both resilience and grace. One afternoon, a fierce wind swept across the plains, carrying a fine powder of snow that stung the skin like sand. Daniel and Margaret were repairing a stretch of fence when the gusts grew so strong they had to lean against the posts to keep their footing. The mare tied nearby tossed her head and snorted, eyes wide with alarm. Before Daniel could reach her, Margaret moved with quick, confident steps, speaking in a low voice that cut through the roar of the wind. Her calm presence steadied the frightened animal within moments. Daniel watched with quiet admiration, struck again by the quiet authority she carried in every movement. When she turned back toward him, cheeks flushed and eyes bright against the cold, he felt a surge of gratitude that left him momentarily speechless. Evenings became the heart of their growing companionship. After long days in the biting air, they shared simple meals by the fire, the lamplight softening the lines of their faces. Margaret began to reveal small fragments of her past, always in measured pieces, like someone testing the strength of new trust. She spoke of the household where she had labored since childhood, of the endless tasks that filled her days and the contracts that kept her bound long after she was grown. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet dignity that made the injustice of her story even more striking. Daniel listened carefully, asking gentle questions but never pressing when she chose silence. The way she carried her history, without self-pity, without surrender, taught him more about strength than any hard winter ever could. On nights when the wind howled across the prairie, rattling the windows like a restless spirit, they sat close to the stove and shared stories of the land. Daniel spoke of his grandparents who had carved the ranch from wild soil, of the floods and droughts that shaped every decision. Margaret listened with a stillness that felt like respect. Sometimes she offered her own observations about the cattle or the weather, her insights sharp and practical. Daniel began to rely on those insights, trusting her judgment as naturally as he trusted the rising sun. Their partnership deepened not through grand gestures but through 1,000 small exchanges. A shared glance when a fence held against the storm, a silent nod when a calf was coaxed to stand, a quiet smile across the table when the day's work was finally done. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from the distant town where Daniel managed his accounts. The bank threatened foreclosure if he could not meet the next payment. The words cut like ice, and for a moment the familiar weight of hopelessness returned to his chest. He folded the letter and set it aside, unsure how to tell Margaret. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she noticed his silence and asked gently what troubled him. He hesitated, but the steady kindness in her eyes left no room for pretense. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it slowly, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the threat behind the neat lines of ink. When she finished, she looked up and said only, "Then we will work harder." There was no fear in her voice, no question of whether they would fight. In that simple statement, Daniel heard the promise of solidarity, a vow to share the burden without complaint. The following weeks became a test of endurance. They rose before the first glimmer of light, working long into the fading twilight to cut costs and strengthen the herd. Margaret organized every corner of the ranch with quiet efficiency, finding ways to stretch supplies and repurpose tools. She bartered with neighboring homesteads, trading sewing and mending for extra feed. Her ingenuity saved money Daniel hadn't known they could spare. Together, they moved through each challenge with a shared determination that surprised them both. The ranch slowly responded. Cattle grew healthier, fences held against the wind, and the small ledger of expenses began to balance. What once seemed like an inevitable collapse now felt like a fight they might actually win. Through it all, a bond grew between them that neither dared name. It lived in the comfortable silences as they rode across the prairie, in the easy laughter that sometimes rose while they worked, and in the quiet moments when their eyes met across the dinner table. Daniel found himself noticing details he had long ignored. The gentle curve of Margaret's smile when she tasted fresh coffee, the way her hands moved with patient precision as she stitched a torn sleeve, the soft hum of a tune she carried from a past life she rarely spoke of. These small observations filled the empty spaces of his days, brightening even the hardest chores. One evening, after a particularly long day repairing the roof of the barn, they sat on the porch to watch the sunset. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted with streaks of deep orange and fading violet. The air smelled of fresh hay and distant rain. Margaret leaned against the railing, her face softened by the glow of the fading light. Daniel felt the urge to speak, to tell her how much her presence had changed the ranch and his life, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he handed her a mug of coffee and said simply, "It's better with you here." She turned her head, eyes reflecting the colors of the sky, and gave a small, quiet smile. No reply was needed. The truth hung between them like the first star of evening. Winter began to loosen its grip, but the nights remained cold. One stormy evening, as icy rain tapped against the windows, Margaret brought out a small piece of fabric she had been saving. It was part of an old dress, worn thin but carefully folded. She told Daniel it was the last remnant of her childhood, a scrap of color from a time before work and contracts defined her world. She planned to sew it into a quilt for the cabin, a reminder that even the hardest lives hold pieces of beauty worth preserving. Daniel watched her fingers move with careful grace, stitching the fabric into a pattern that spoke of endurance and quiet hope. The sight stirred something deep within him, a recognition that her presence was no longer temporary. She belonged here, not as a worker, but as part of the life he wanted to build. The days grew longer, and the ranch began to show signs of renewal. Calves were born healthy and strong, their playful leaps a promise of seasons to come. The creek swelled with melting ice, its clear water reflecting the first shoots of green along its banks. Daniel and Margaret worked side by side through it all, their partnership as natural as the turning of the earth. Though neither spoke of the future, both felt its shape taking form in the quiet spaces between chores and shared meals. Each sunrise brought new challenges, but also the steady comfort of a companion who understood the language of survival and the power of unspoken trust. When neighbors stopped by, they remarked on the changes: a sturdier fence here, healthier cattle there, a brightness in the house that had been absent for years. Some offered polite congratulations, others gave knowing smiles, but Daniel and Margaret responded with the same quiet humility. They had no need to explain. The proof of their labor lay in the thriving land and the calm steadiness that filled the cabin at night. In their eyes, progress was not measured in dollars or praise, but in the shared satisfaction of work well done, and the quiet certainty that neither of them faced the future alone. As the last snows melted and the prairie began to wake, Daniel felt a new steadiness settle in his heart. The ranch was still fragile, its future uncertain, but the fear that had once haunted his nights had faded. Margaret's presence had done more than help him fight the land. It had softened the loneliness that had weighed on him for years. Together, they had faced storms, debts, and the relentless demands of winter. Together they had begun to carve a new life from the hard soil of the frontier. And though the path ahead remained unspoken, Daniel knew with quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. Spring crept across the prairie in slow, deliberate steps, melting the last crusts of ice and loosening the soil that had slept under winter's weight. Daniel noticed the changes first in the sound of the creek, a fuller, livelier murmur that carried across the fields before dawn. Then came the shoots of grass pushing through patches of dark, wet earth, a stubborn green that seemed to promise survival even after the harshest cold. Each morning the air smelled of damp soil and new beginnings, and with it came a sense of cautious hope. The ranch, once teetering on the edge of collapse, felt alive again. But more than the land, it was the quiet partnership inside the farmhouse that seemed to grow strongest with every lengthening day. The thaw meant longer hours and harder work. Calves needed tagging and feeding, fences needed strengthening before summer storms, and the barn required endless repairs. Margaret rose each morning before the first streak of light and joined Daniel in the yard, her scarf tied tight against the lingering chill. She moved with the same steady determination that had carried her through winter, but there was a new ease in her step, a quiet energy that matched the changing season. Together they worked from dawn until dusk, their movements so synchronized that words were rarely needed. Daniel found himself anticipating her next action as naturally as he anticipated the sun's rise, handing her tools before she asked, catching her eye with a silent nod when a job was well done. The ranch responded to their combined effort. Cattle that had survived the harsh winter began to put on weight, their coats glossy under the growing warmth. The repaired fences held firm against spring winds, and the vegetable plot Margaret had planned during the cold months showed its first timid sprouts. Each small success added to a growing sense of stability, a fragile but undeniable shift from mere survival to something closer to prosperity. Daniel kept the bank's threatening letter folded in a drawer, but he no longer felt the same dread when he touched it. There was still a long road ahead, but now he believed it was a road they could travel together. Evenings on the porch became their quiet reward. After long days of labor, they sat side by side in the fading light, mugs of coffee or tin cups of water warming their hands. The prairie stretched before them in wide sweeps of gold and green, alive with the chirping of insects and the distant call of meadowlarks. Sometimes they spoke of the day's work, trading observations about the cattle or the weather. Other times they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the sky deepen from amber to indigo. In those still moments, Daniel felt an ease he had not known in years, a calm born not only of hard work accomplished, but of the presence of someone who understood the quiet language of the land. As the days lengthened, Margaret began to share more pieces of her story. It happened in fragments, often during small tasks when her hands were busy and her eyes focused elsewhere. While mending a harness one afternoon, she told Daniel about the day she first realized the contract that bound her would not end when she reached adulthood. The wealthy family who claimed her labor had written the agreement so carefully that escape seemed impossible. She spoke without drama, her voice level but tinged with the faintest echo of old grief. Daniel listened in silence, feeling the injustice of it burn inside him. He wanted to rage on her behalf, to promise that those who had used her would one day face judgment. But Margaret did not seek vengeance. She sought only to live freely now, to build something honest from the years she could never reclaim. One night, as a warm breeze stirred the curtains and the moon spilled silver across the floor, Daniel finally asked the question that had lingered in his mind since the day they met. "Why did you agree to come with me?" he said quietly. "You didn't know me. You had every reason to distrust a stranger." Margaret looked up from the quilt she was stitching, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lantern. "Because you offered freedom," she said after a pause. "Not promises, not pity, just a way out. I recognized honesty when I heard it." Her words settled deep inside him, heavy with meaning. He realized that in offering her a chance at freedom, He had also given himself something he hadn't dared to name, a partner whose strength matched his own. Their connection deepened in countless small moments. Daniel found himself looking for reasons to work near her, to hear the low melody of her humming, or to catch the quick, bright flash of her smile. He began to share stories of his own past, of childhood summers chasing stray calves, of the quiet grief of losing his parents too soon. Margaret listened with the same calm attention she gave to every task, her steady presence making even painful memories easier to bear. In her company, Daniel felt a kind of peace he had never known, as if the vast, unforgiving prairie had finally offered him a place to rest. The neighbors began to notice changes too. A traveling feed salesman stopped by one afternoon and remarked on the improved condition of the herd, his eyes lingering on Margaret as she worked alongside Daniel to stack bales in the barn. "You've got good help," the man said with a grin. Daniel nodded, resisting the urge to correct him. Margaret was more than help. She was the reason the ranch stood stronger than before, the reason he no longer faced each day with a knot of dread in his chest. After the salesman left, Daniel caught Margaret watching him with a knowing smile, as if she understood the unspoken truth between them. Spring storms tested their progress, bringing sudden downpours and fierce winds that turned the prairie sky black in an instant. One evening, a wall of thunderclouds rolled in from the west, lightning flashing across the horizon. Daniel and Margaret raced to secure the livestock, their voices barely audible over the rising wind. Rain lashed their faces as they worked, soaking their clothes and turning the ground to slick mud. At one point, a frightened calf broke through a gate, and without hesitation Margaret sprinted into the storm to guide it back, her figure a blur of determination against the sheets of rain. Daniel caught up and helped steer the animal to safety, his heart pounding with more than exertion. When they finally stumbled back to the cabin, drenched and breathless, he felt a surge of gratitude so fierce it left him trembling. In that wild, chaotic night, he understood how much he had come to depend on her, not just for labor, but for the quiet courage that anchored them both. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean and the air rich with the scent of wet earth. Inside the cabin, they peeled off soaked coats and boots, their laughter breaking through the exhaustion as they recounted the chaos of the evening. Margaret's hair clung in damp strands to her cheeks, her eyes bright with the thrill of survival. Daniel found himself watching her with a mix of admiration and something warmer, something he could no longer ignore. He caught her gaze and saw the same spark reflected back at him, a silent recognition of the bond forged in shared struggle. As the weeks rolled on, the ranch began to thrive. Calves grew strong, the creek ran clear, and the fields shimmered with new grass. Daniel made a careful trip to town and returned with supplies paid for in full, a quiet victory that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. He and Margaret worked side by side to plan the next season, rotating pastures, planting a larger vegetable garden, repairing the old windmill that had stood silent for years. Each plan felt less like a chore and more like a promise, a step toward a future built not on desperation, but on choice. Through it all, neither of them spoke openly about what was forming between them. Their relationship remained wrapped in the simple language of work and daily life, yet the unspoken understanding grew stronger with every passing day. When Daniel handed her a tool, their fingers lingered a heartbeat longer. When Margaret served supper, their eyes met with a quiet warmth that said more than words ever could. They were two people scarred by years of hardship, slowly learning to trust the possibility of happiness. As spring deepened into early summer, the prairie transformed into a sea of color. Wildflowers burst across the hills, and the air buzzed with the hum of bees. Daniel and Margaret often ended their long days with slow walks along the creek, the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold. Sometimes they spoke of practical matters, cattle prices, weather forecasts, the repairs still needed on the south fence. Other times they said nothing at all, letting the music of the creek and the rustle of grass carry their thoughts. In those quiet twilight walks, Daniel felt a certainty growing inside him, as natural and undeniable as the changing seasons. Something extraordinary had begun the day he raised his hand at that auction, though neither of them could have foreseen it. And now, with the ranch alive around them and the future stretching wide as the prairie sky, he knew that the choice he made was shaping a life richer than he had ever dared to imagine. Summer arrived on the prairie with a steady heat that shimmered across the fields and carried the scent of sun-baked grass through every open window of the farmhouse. The mornings began earlier now, with a faint gray glow seeping across the horizon long before the rooster crowed. Daniel woke to the familiar creak of floorboards and the quiet rustle of Margaret moving through the kitchen. The smell of coffee mingled with the warm air, and the soft clink of dishes became the music of a new season. He stepped outside to find the land alive in a way it had not been for years. The creek, once a thin ribbon of mud, now ran strong and clear. Cattle grazed on thick grass that waved in slow ripples under the rising sun. Where once he had seen only struggle, Daniel now saw possibility, and beside him stood the woman who had helped make it real. Their days filled quickly with the work of a thriving ranch. Calves needed herding, fences required inspection, and the vegetable garden demanded constant care. Margaret moved with the same quiet determination she had carried through winter, but now her pace was lighter, her laughter easier. She sang while hanging laundry, her voice low and melodic, blending with the buzz of bees and the soft whisper of prairie winds. Daniel often paused to listen, the sound threading through the long hours of labor like a promise of peace. He marveled at how naturally she had claimed this life, how seamlessly she had turned a house of solitude into a home where every corner held signs of care. Trips to town became necessary again, as the ranch began to produce more than it consumed. Daniel and Margaret loaded wagons with fresh vegetables and barrels of milk to trade for supplies. At the market, neighbors greeted them with curiosity and quiet admiration. Whispers followed them, about the woman who had arrived alone and the rancher who had once been on the brink of losing everything. Some offered sly smiles, others warm handshakes, but Daniel paid little attention to the rumors. He watched Margaret instead, noting the calm dignity with which she moved among the townsfolk. She bartered with confidence, her sharp mind securing fair deals that left even seasoned traders nodding in respect. When they left with a full wagon and a small purse of profits, Daniel felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money. On the long rides home, they talked about the future in quiet, careful terms. Margaret spoke of planting fruit trees along the creek, of adding a smokehouse for curing meat before the next winter. Daniel shared his hopes of expanding the herd and repairing the old barn his grandfather had built. These conversations unfolded slowly, like the gradual lengthening of summer days, each word a small step toward a shared vision neither of them had dared to imagine months before. The plans were practical, yet beneath them ran a current of something deeper, a recognition that their lives were no longer separate struggles but a single story being written together. As the heat of July settled over the land, Daniel found himself reflecting on the path that had led them here. He remembered the first time he had seen Margaret at the auction yard, standing alone against the cold wind with eyes that held a lifetime of endurance. He remembered the stormy nights of winter when they worked side by side to keep the cattle alive, the quiet meals by the stove, the unspoken understanding that grew with every shared hardship. Those memories rose like distant thunder on warm afternoons, filling him with a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. He realized that what had begun as an act of necessity had become the most important choice of his life. The bond between them deepened in small, unremarkable moments that carried the weight of something larger. One evening, after a long day repairing the windmill, Daniel returned to the cabin to find Margaret waiting on the porch. She held a small cloth bundle in her hands, and when he sat beside her, she unfolded it to reveal a simple meal of bread and cheese. "You've been working too hard," she said with a quiet smile. They ate in comfortable silence as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sound of crickets rose from the tall grass. Daniel felt a warmth that went beyond the summer air, a sense of belonging that reached into the deepest parts of his heart. Their partnership was tested again when a late-season storm swept across the prairie. Dark clouds rolled in without warning, bringing fierce winds and sudden rain that threatened to flood the lower pastures. Daniel and Margaret worked through the night, guiding the herd to higher ground and securing the barns against the rising water. Mud soaked their boots and lightning split the sky, but they moved with the practiced rhythm of people who trusted each other completely. When the storm finally passed and the first light of dawn revealed the ranch safe and intact, they stood together in the wet grass, breathing hard, their clothes clinging to their skin. Margaret turned to Daniel with a tired smile and said, "We make a good team." The simple truth of her words settled between them like the quiet after a hymn. As summer reached its height, Daniel began the process of settling the legal matters that had shadowed Margaret's past. The contract that once bound her was complicated, written to trap her in endless servitude, but with careful planning and the modest profits from the ranch, Daniel found a lawyer willing to untangle the web. Papers were signed in a small office in town, the ink drying on a document that declared her free beyond dispute. Margaret accepted the papers with steady hands and a single deep breath, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Daniel watched her closely, wanting to say something but finding no words strong enough to match the moment. She looked up at him and gave a small nod, as if to say that freedom, once claimed, required no grand declaration. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm after that. The fear of losing the land faded as profits slowly grew. Neighbors who once doubted Daniel's ability to keep the ranch began to stop by with offers of trade and friendship. Some came out of curiosity, eager to meet the woman whose strength had become quiet legend among the scattered homesteads. Margaret greeted them with the same calm dignity she carried everywhere, her presence softening even the most skeptical visitor. Children from nearby farms followed her with wide eyes, drawn by the gentle way she spoke to animals and the patient manner in which she taught them small tasks. Daniel often stood back and watched, his heart swelling with a pride that felt both fierce and tender. As the long days of summer began to shorten, the prairie shifted once again. The grasses turned from bright green to muted gold, and the evening air carried the first hints of autumn. Daniel and Margaret prepared for the coming season with the quiet confidence of people who had already faced the worst together. They harvested vegetables, repaired the roofs of outbuildings, and stored hay for the winter. Each task was a reminder of how far they had come since that bleak day, when Daniel first rode into town in search of help. What had begun as a business arrangement had grown into something neither of them had planned but both now cherished. A partnership built on respect, resilience, and a love that needed no name to be real. One evening, as the first cool breeze of fall whispered across the fields, Daniel and Margaret walked along the creek that had once nearly dried to nothing. The water now flowed steady and clear, reflecting the deepening colors of the sky. They stopped at a bend where the setting sun painted the surface in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel reached for her hand, a gesture as natural as breathing. She did not pull away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with his and looked out over the land they had fought to save. No words passed between them. None were needed. The gentle pressure of her hand told the whole story, a story of struggle and redemption, of freedom won and a future quietly, steadily built on trust. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, a vast canvas of fading light and silent promise. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, its lonely cry rising into the warm evening air. Daniel listened, feeling the sound echo through the years of hardship that had brought them to this place. Beside him, Margaret stood strong and unyielding, her face softened by the glow of the dying sun. Together they watched the sky deepen to violet, the first stars appearing like tiny sparks of hope. The land that had once threatened to break them now held them in a quiet embrace, bearing witness to the life they had forged from determination, courage, and the simple power of human kindness.